He was the only one who heard the wolves' plea, the only one who saw the real crime. And in the end, he was the only one put in handcuffs. In a blinding blizzard, Asa was surrounded by the white pack. But they weren't attacking. They were leading him. They trusted him. They were begging him to save their yearling, dying in a brutal steel trap. As his own hands, torn and bloody, were just seconds from freeing it. A shot rang out, but it didn't come from the trapper. It came from the law. The cold was not an enemy, not to Asa. It was a presence, a heavy, breathing thing that settled over the high country when the sun was low. He felt its weight on his shoulders like a familiar blanket, the fibers stiff with frost. His boots, the leather worn smooth as river stone, made almost no sound on the crusted snow. He moved like the slow, patient shifting of rock, a part of the landscape, not an intruder upon it. He was the last who knew the old names for these ridges, the ones that curled like the spine of a sleeping bear. The last who came not to take, but to watch. The paper maps in the county office drew lines over this land, called it National Forest or Block 4A. But Asa knew its real name, whispered only in the language of his grandmother. A name that meant the place where the wind rests. The silence of the high country was different today. It wasn't the full breathing silence he knew, the one filled with the distant snap of a twig or the tiny squeak of a pika deep in the rocks. This was a held breath, a tightness in the air that prickled the skin under his wool collar. Something was wrong. He called them family, the white pack. He had watched the alpha female grow from a gangly puppy, had seen her test her strength and choose her mate. He knew their hunting paths, their dens, the way they moved through the lodgepole pines like ghosts. They were the true guardians of this place, and he, in turn, was theirs. The feeling of wrong had been with him since sunup. A splinter of iron in the air, a metallic taste at the back of his throat. Something mechanical, a violation. He stopped at the crest of a ridge, the wind pulling at the gray braids tied at his back. The view stretched out for 50 miles, a sea of white and dark green, sharp and clear in the thin air. He reached into the worn buckskin pouch that never left his belt. It had been his grandfather's. He took a pinch of dry tobacco, crumbled and sacred. He held the tobacco to the east, where the sun had risen weak and pale. To the south, where the air was warmer. To the west, where the sun would soon die. And to the north, the direction of the cold and the challenge. He lowered his hand to the snow-covered earth, and finally held it to his heart. His lips moved, but the words were not for his own ears, or even for the winds. They were for the land itself, and for the family he sought. A prayer not of request, but of acknowledgement, a plea for balance. He was not an owner of this land. The government said so. But the land itself, the ancient granite and the 1,000-year-old pines, they knew his name. They knew his blood. He was its witness, its memory, its guardian. And there, in the deepening blue of the snow shadow 50 yards below, he saw them. Tracks, fresh. He made his way down the slope, his movements still economical, his bad knee aching with a dull, prophetic throb. He knelt, pulling off a mitten to feel the sharp edges of the print, a large male, the alpha. He brushed the snow away. The scent was clean, sharp, and wild. Wolf. But underneath it, faint and sour, was the other thing. The iron. The wrongness. The tracks were heavy, the gait uneven. They were not running. They were pacing. Waiting. Asa looked up, his eyes scanning the dense line of trees where the tracks led. The tightness in the air was stronger now. The silence was no longer a held breath. It was a scream, frozen before it could be heard. The feeling of wrong now had a direction. It was a cold knot in his gut. He had prayed for their safety, but the ancestors knew that prayer required action. He pulled his collar tighter, the old wool smelling of wood smoke and time, and followed the tracks into the falling dark. 20 miles east and 3,000 feet lower, the cold was just a different kind of mean. It wasn't the clean, thin bite of the high country. It was a damp, clinging chill that found its way through the cracked rubber seals of the truck cab. Silas crushed his cigarette into the overflowing ashtray on the dash, the filter hissing against a dozen others. His truck, a '94 Ford that had been blue a long time ago, idled with a rattling cough that matched his own. The land around him wasn't a temple. It was a factory that had stopped paying. Silas looked at the clipboard on his passenger seat. The ledger was thin. Fur prices were in the toilet, and the elk tags he'd managed to fill for out-of-state hunters hadn't covered the cost of his diesel. He was a man of wires, steel, and sense. A man who understood the precise mechanics of death, and he was failing. He was failing because the factory's management had changed. He blamed the government, of course, those desk jockeys in Bozeman who thought they could play God. But mostly, he blamed the wolves, and he hated the white pack. They were ghosts, people said. He'd heard the talk in the tavern down in town, talk from hikers and bird watchers. He'd even heard the old, half-crazy Indian, he didn't know Ace's name, only his description, was seen up on the ridges, watching them. Silas spat out the window, watching. He knew what he'd like to do. They weren't ghosts. They were just smart. Too smart. They'd learned his traps, learned his scents. They'd taken 3 prime elk off his bait stations last season. They weren't hunting to eat. They were hunting for sport. That's what he told himself. They were killing his livelihood out of spite. He killed the engine. The sudden silence was heavy, broken only by the tink, tink, tink of the cooling manifold. He got out, the truck's door groaning in protest. He pulled a heavy canvas pack from the bed, the metal inside clinking softly, lethally. He slammed the tailgate, a sharp, angry sound that died fast in the snow-heavy trees. This wasn't his permitted line. This was adjacent. An old logging spur, forgotten and overgrown. He knew the regulations. He knew the seasons. He also knew he had a mortgage payment and a deep, sour anger that needed feeding. He moved fast, not with Ace's patience, but with a grim, practiced efficiency. He knew this game trail. It was a perfect bottleneck, a natural funnel between a sheer rock face and a tangle of fallen timber. He found the spot. He kicked at the snow, his boot heel finding the frozen dirt. He knelt, pulling a small trowel from his pack. He dug a shallow, precise hole. From the pack he pulled the first one, a Nutter 4-coil spring trap. Steel, oiled against the rust, its jaws heavy and toothed. It was illegal for canines in this state. He didn't care. He worked with brutal skill. He set the tension, the metal click sounding too loud in the woods. He placed it in the hole, anchored by a chain to a buried drag. He took a small bottle from his coat, a foul-smelling liquid, a mix of glands and rotted bait, and put a single drop on a twig just past the trap. He carefully sifted snow over the steel, using a pine bough to brush away his tracks, to make it look like nothing had ever been there. He set 3 more, a steel line of defense, a line of hate. He stood up, his knees cracking. He looked back at his work, invisible now. "Come on, you white bastards," he muttered, the fog from his breath snatched away by the wind. "Come see what I left for you." He was the intruder. But in his mind, he was the native. He was the one who belonged here, the one who worked the land while others just watched it. The wolves, the government, the Indians. They were the outsiders, the ones who had changed the rules. Silas shouldered his empty pack. He felt a grim, cold satisfaction. The splinter of iron that Asa had sensed in the air was now firmly in the ground, waiting. The tracks led him through a choke of aspen, their white bark like skeletal reminders in the fading light. The air was so still he could hear the tiny hiss of his own parka as he moved. The wrongness was a physical weight now, a metallic cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. The tracks were no longer just pacing, they were circling. But circling what? He was the one following. Yet he had the growing, prickling sensation that he was the one being led. He emerged from the aspen grove into a small, snow-filled meadow, a cup of white held in the palm of the mountains. The wind had swept it clean, and the silence was absolute. He stopped, his gaze sweeping the perimeter. The tracks led into this clearing, and then they vanished, as if the pack had been lifted by the air itself. His grandmother had told him stories of this, how the old ones could walk on the crust of the snow without leaving a trace, how they could become the wind. He was not a man given to fantasy, but he was a man who respected what he did not fully understand. And then he saw it. A flicker of movement on the ridge above him. Not a deer, too low, not a coyote, too confident. A shadow detached itself from the line of dark pines. It was gray-white, the color of dirty snow and moonlight. It stood for a heartbeat, watching him. Then it was gone. He let out a breath he didn't know he was holding, the plume of it hanging in the air. He was being watched. He took another step into the meadow, and the world changed. A second shadow moved to his left. A third to his right blocked his path back to the aspens. They were not shadows. They were wolves. The white pack. His heart didn't pound with fear. It gave a single, hard thump against his ribs, a drumbeat of acknowledgement. He was surrounded. This was the moment from the posters in the ranger station, the moment the pamphlets warned about. Aggressive, territorial. His hand, by instinct, would have gone to the knife on his belt, but he held it still. He knew, in a way he could not explain, that this was not an attack. This was an appointment. 7 of them. They materialized from the landscape, their pelts a perfect camouflage against the snow and the blue shadows of the pines. They formed a loose, patient circle. Their breath plumed in the twilight, their yellow eyes fixed on him with an intelligence that was ancient and unnamed. He stood in the center of the circle, the focus of 7 predators, and did the one thing that made no sense. He did not run. He did not shout. He did not even reach for his knife. He slowly, deliberately, lowered the hood of his parka. He let the cold air hit his face, his gray braids. He wanted them to see him. Not the hiker, not the intruder, but Asa. The alpha female stepped forward. He knew her. He called her She Who Remembers. She was magnificent, larger than her mate, her fur thick and tipped with silver. She was the one he had watched grow. She was the matriarch. She stopped 20 yards from him. She did not growl. She did not bare her teeth. She simply watched. The intensity of her gaze was a physical thing, a question. Asa raised his bare hand, palm open, not in surrender, but in greeting. "I am here," he said. The words were quiet, spoken in the language of his people, a language the mountains themselves remembered. The sound was soft, guttural, swallowed by the snow. "I am Asa. I walk in respect." The pack was silent. The only sound was the faint, shush of the wind, moving through the high branches, 1,000 feet above them. The tension was still there, a wire pulled taut. But it was not the tension of a hunt. It was the tension of a negotiation. The alpha female, she who remembers, held his gaze for a long moment. He saw in her eyes the reflection of the dying light, the cold, and a deep, unsettling knowledge. She knew. She knew what he had only sensed. Then, she broke the stare. She turned her great head and looked back up the trail, a path he had not seen, leading deeper into the shadows. She looked back at him. A low sound came from her chest, not a growl, but a summons, a deep, resonant woof. The circle did not break. It shifted. The wolf to his right stepped back, opening the path. The confrontation was over. The invitation had been given. Asa pulled his hood back up, his heart heavy with a new understanding. They hadn't been circling him. They had been waiting for him. The wrongness in the air was not for him. It was for them. And they had come to the only other guardian they knew. To walk with them was a different thing entirely. Asa had spent a lifetime walking after them, reading their history in the snow. Now, he was part of that history. The pack reformed, not in a circle around him, but in a moving, fluid wedge. The alpha female, she who remembers, took the lead. The large male, her mate, fell in behind Asa, a silent, heavy presence at his back. He was not a guest. He was an escort. He moved in their world now, and the rules were different. He had to match their pace, a ground-eating lope that was deceptively fast. His bad knee, which had ached all day, was now screaming a hot, sharp protest. He ignored it. He focused on the silver-tipped fur of the alpha female, a beacon in the gathering gloom. They didn't go far. Perhaps another quarter-mile, up a slight rise and into a bottleneck of rock and fallen trees. Asa felt the terrain shift before he saw it, the open meadow giving way to a natural, constricted path. A perfect place for a trap. The metallic taste of wrongness, the one he'd sensed on the wind all day, was no longer faint. It was thick in his throat. It was the smell of rusted iron and something else, something deeply foul, the sour, high-pitched scent of panic. The pack stopped. The alpha male at his back let out a low, vibrating growl that Asa felt in the soles of his boots. It wasn't directed at him. It was directed at the scene ahead. The alpha female turned, her yellow eyes locking onto his. She did not need to make a sound. The look was a command, a plea, and a transference of all her fear and rage. She nudged her head forward, urging him into the small clearing. Asa stepped past her, and the world narrowed to a single, terrible point. It was one of the yearlings, a small female, her fur the color of cream. She was caught, not in a clean, killing snare, but in the toothed steel jaws of a coil spring trap. It had clamped shut on her left foreleg, just above the paw. She had fought it. The snow around her was churned and bloody, the chain pulled taut to a drag that had snagged on a buried root. She was exhausted, lying on her side, panting in shallow, terrified gasps. Her eyes, wide with shock, found his. A low, sick anger, cold and heavy, settled in Asa's stomach. He took a slow step forward. The pup tried to scramble back, letting out a sharp yelp of pain, and the trap's jaws bit deeper. "Easy, little one," Asa murmured, the English words slipping out, his voice thick. "I am here. Easy now." He knelt in the blood-stained snow. The pack watched from 10 yards back, a silent, anxious jury. He needed to see the trap. He needed to know. He brushed the snow away from the steel ring, The pup's leg was badly broken, the bone likely shattered. But it was the trap itself that made his breath catch. He knew this trap. He had seen them before in the back of Silas's rusting truck when he was in town for supplies. It was a number 4, oiled, toothed, illegal for this use. And on the steel just visible was a small S that the trapper had filed into the metal plate. Silas. This was not an accident. This was not a legal trapper's mistake. This was a crime. This was hate, made of steel and set in the snow. The splinter of iron he had felt in the air all day was Silas's poisoned malice. He had not been sensing a natural wrongness. He had been sensing this. He looked from the brutal, simple machine to the yearling's pain-filled eyes. He looked up at the alpha female, she who remembers, who watched him with a desperate, knowing stillness. Her gaze said what words could not. He did this to us. You are the only one who understands. You must fix this. The silent plea was no longer just about saving a life. It was about an entire world of pain, of intrusion, of a law that did not protect them, and a hate that actively hunted them. It was a plea for a justice that the mountains could not provide on their own. Asa pulled off his thick mittens, his hands shaking, not from the cold, but from a rage so deep it felt like prayer. He looked at the pup, his voice now a low, steady whisper in the language of his people. I am here, little sister. The fault is with my people, but the help will also come from me. The race had begun. Time was a different beast up here. It was measured in the slow creep of shadows, in the inches of falling snow, in the life draining from the yearling's eyes. Asa had no modern tools. He had no bolt cutters, no pry bars. He had his hands, his knife, and a lifetime of understanding how things worked, both flesh and steel. He pulled his knife from its sheath. It was old. The blade sharpened so many times, it was half its original width. The handle worn to the precise grip of his hand. It was a tool for skinning, for carving, not for fighting steel. But it was all he had. Listen to me, little sister, he said, his voice a low, steady rumble that cut through the pup's panicked breathing. He didn't look at the pack, though he could feel the weight of their gaze like a physical pressure on his back. His world had shrunk to the pup and the trap. This will be hard. This will hurt. But it is the only way. You must be still. He placed one knee in the snow, his bad leg screaming, and leaned over the trap. He needed to compress the springs, but they were designed to be set by a man putting his full weight on them. Releasing them under this tension, with a mangled leg in the way, was a different, more dangerous physics problem. He tried to use the knife blade as a lever, jamming it into the coil mechanism. The steel of the trap was too strong. It only scraped, sending a high-pitched scree into the air that made the pup flinch, yelping. No, that is not the way. He resheathed the knife. He would have to use his hands, his bare hands. He stripped off his inner gloves, stuffing them into his parka pocket. He needed to feel the metal. He examined the jaws. The teeth were angled, designed to hold, to grip, to tear. He saw the dark, frozen blood. He saw where the bone, white and slick, had pushed through the fur. He would have to touch that. Forgive me, he whispered. He put his left hand on the pup's shoulder, a firm, grounding pressure. He could feel the desperate, rabbit-quick heartbeat through the thick fur. Now, with his right hand, he found a purchase on the upper jaw of the trap. With his left, he grabbed the lower. He was fighting the stored energy of 2 heavy-duty coil springs. He was fighting the cold, which made his fingers feel like brittle wood. He squeezed. He pulled his hands together, his arms shaking with the effort, the muscles in his back and shoulders bunching. The trap did not move. It was frozen, locked by tension and ice. He let out a ragged breath. The pack, sensing his struggle, took a collective, restless step forward. The alpha female let out a low, questioning whine. Not yet. Asa grunted, not to them, but to the trap itself. He repositioned his grip. He had to break the ice's seal. He put his full weight into it, his body leaning over the pup. He was no longer a man. He was a force, a counterforce to the one Silas had set. He was the law of nature pushing back against the law of malice. He felt a crack. Not the pup's bone, but the ice. The trap gave a millimeter. Ha! The sound was an explosion from his chest. He found the rhythm. He ignored the pain in his knee, the burn in his shoulders. He squeezed, the metal biting into his bare palms. The jaws began to open. 1 inch, 2. The pup whined, its leg now free but still trapped, within the open jaws. "It is time, little sister," he gasped, his voice strained. "When I lift, you pull. Pull." He didn't know if it understood. He didn't care. He gave one final, desperate heave. He pulled the steel jaws apart as far as they would go, his vision graying at the edges from the strain. He held it, his entire body trembling like a bowstring. He was there. He was at the edge of success. The pup, sensing the release of pressure, scrambled, trying to pull its mangled leg free. Hope, sharp and bright as the snow, flooded Asa's chest. He was going to do it. He was going to win. It was in this exact moment, this pinnacle of effort and hope, that the sound of the world split open. A high, mechanical whine, alien and violent, ripped through the sacred silence of the trees. A snowmobile. The pup froze. The pack scattered, vanishing like smoke. Asa's head snapped up, his hands, in that split second of distraction, slipping. The steel jaws, with all the stored, hateful energy of Silas's anger, snapped shut. The snap of the trap resetting was a sound of absolute finality. It was louder than a rifle shot in the frozen air. Asa jerked his hands back, his palms stinging, the skin torn and bleeding where he'd fought the steel. He was free. The yearling was not. The trap, released from his grip, had clamped down again, harder, with a sickening metallic crunch. The yearling, which had been scrambling with hope, gave a high, terrible scream that was half whine, half gurgle. Then it went limp. Its eyes rolled back, showing the whites. It had passed out, or perhaps it was already dying. Asa knelt, frozen, staring at his bloody, useless hands. The hope he'd felt, that bright, sharp thing, was gone, replaced by a cold, hollow sickness in his stomach. The high-pitched, mechanical scream of the snowmobiles was on top of him. 2 of them. They burst through the line of pines, green and white, like predators of a different, colder age. U.S. Forest Service was stenciled on the side in stark, blocky letters. They slid to a stop, skis digging in, engines idling with an impatient, rattling brrrap, brrrap, brrrap that fouled the clean air with the smell of exhaust. The man on the lead machine was built like a fence post, all hard lines and wire. He killed his engine. The sudden silence that fell was heavy, accusing, broken only by the tick-tick-tick of the cooling motor. He pushed his visor up. His face was weathered, his eyes the color of a winter sky, and they held no warmth at all. The passenger on the second machine was younger. He pulled his helmet off entirely, his face pale. He was local. Asa had seen him in the feed store in town. The young ranger's eyes were wide, darting from Asa to the trap, to the limp wolf pup. "Asa?" the young ranger, Ben, said, his voice hesitant, lost in the sudden cold quiet. What in God's name happened here?" The lead ranger, Miller, slid off his machine. He didn't look at Asa. He looked at the scene, his gaze taking in the churned, bloody snow, the illegal trap, and Asa kneeling over it. His face hardened. "Sir, I need you to step away from the animal, now." Miller's voice was flat. It was not a request. It was an order, delivered as if he were reading from a manual. Asa couldn't move. He was still locked in the moment of failure. It was caught. I was trying. "You are interfering with federal wildlife." Miller took a deliberate step forward. He unclipped a heavy-duty tranquilizer pistol from a holster on his vest. He didn't aim it at Asa. He aimed it past him, at the dark trees where the rest of the white pack lingered, a ring of silent, anxious shadows. "That is a crime." "Chief, hold on," Ben said, dismounting from his own machine. "This is Asa. He lives up here. He wouldn't hurt. Look at the trap. That's a number 4. That's illegal." "I am looking at the trap, Ranger," Miller said, his voice cutting. He still hadn't made eye contact with Asa. His focus was on the scene. "And I see a civilian tampering with it. I see a potentially poached animal. And I see an endangered species being harassed." "It's not harassed. It's alive," Ben protested, stepping forward. "For now." Miller finally turned his gaze to Asa. It was like being struck. "Sir, this is your last warning. Stand up, place your hands on top of your head, and back away toward those trees." The world had turned upside down. The tu huyet, the moment of absolute, crushing injustice, had arrived. Asa looked at his bloody hands. He looked at the alpha female, she who remembers, watching from the trees, her yellow eyes no longer holding trust, but a new, cold confusion. He, Asa, had failed. He had not only failed to save the pup, but his presence had now brought the law, this blind, cold thing, into their sacred world. He pushed himself up. His bad knee, which he had forgotten in the adrenaline, buckled. He let out a low grunt of pain and stumbled, catching his balance. "I was helping," he whispered. The words sounded thin, pathetic, stolen by the wind. "You were contaminating a crime scene," Miller stated. "Ben, get the kit. You'll process the animal. I'll handle the witness." Miller's use of the word witness felt like a threat. Asa was forced to turn his back on the yearling, his rescue unfinished, his hands stinging, his heart a cold, dead stone in his chest. He, the guardian, was now just a problem to be handled. Asa stood, his hands raised near his shoulders, palms open. They stung, the cold air biting into the raw skin of his palms where he had fought the trap. He watched, helpless, as the young ranger, Ben, moved past him toward the yearling. Ben was hesitant, his movements reluctant, as if approaching a sacred, forbidden thing. Miller did not move toward the wolf. He moved toward Asa. He unclipped a small notebook and a radio mic from his vest. His motions were clipped, mechanical, precise. He was a man who lived by the book, and the book was all he knew. "You are Asa," Miller stated. It wasn't a question. "You live on the old Henderson parcel." "I am trying to tell you," Asa said, his voice low, a deep rumble of controlled rage. He was not a witness. He was a guardian, and he had failed. "The trap. It is not a legal trap." "I am aware of the equipment, sir," Miller said, his pen hovering over the notepad. "What I am not aware of is what you were doing here. This is a restricted area, and that is an endangered species." "He was saving it." Ben's voice was sharp. He had knelt beside the pup and was now looking at the trap at the S mark. "Chief, he's right. This is a Silas trap. I'd stake my job on it." The name hung in the air, heavy and sour. Silas. Miller's head turned slowly toward Ben. His eyes narrowed. Your job is to process the animal, Ranger, not to stake guesses. Am I clear? But, sir, am I clear? Ben looked down, his face flushing with a mixture of anger and shame. Yes, sir. Clear. He turned his back on them, busying himself with the medical kit, his movements now jerky and angry. Miller turned back to Asa. The accusation was coming, and Asa could feel it, as cold and certain as the snow under his boots. You are obstructing a federal investigation, Mr. Asa. You have contaminated a crime scene. And by your own admission, you were attempting to remove this animal, which is an act of poaching under Federal Statute 16, Section 3372. The words were alien. Poaching. Statute. They were words from a different world, a world of paper and ink, and they had no meaning here, where the only law was the blood in the snow and the grief of the alpha female, who was still watching from the trees. That is not what happened. Asa's hands, still raised, began to shake. Not with fear, but with a profound, seismic anger. You are wrong. You are the one breaking the law of this place. I know who set this trap. His name is Silas. He runs his line on the South Ridge. He has been poisoning this land for years. You are catching the wrong man. His voice had risen. It was not a shout, but it had the power of the mountain in it. It was the first time he had raised his voice in many, many seasons. Miller's expression did not change, but something in his eyes hardened. He saw noncompliance. He saw a threat. Sir, you are agitated, Miller said, his voice dropping into a cold, flat monotone. He reached for his radio mic. I have advised you to remain calm. You are now officially detained for interference. This is madness, Asa whispered. Not to Miller, but to the land, to his ancestors. Ranger Ben. Miller's voice cracked like a whip. Ben stood up, his face pale, his hands now bloody from handling the pup's leg. Sir, secure the suspect. His hands. Use the ties. The tu huyet. The moment of ultimate, unbearable injustice. Ben looked from his chief to Asa and back to the dying pup. He was a man caught between two worlds, and he was being forced to choose. Chief, please, he's an old man. He's not a suspect. He's the one who found it. That is an order, Ranger. Miller's hand went to the sidearm on his hip. Not his tranquilizer gun, his service pistol. He didn't draw it, but the gesture was unmistakable. Secure him, now. Ben's shoulders slumped. He walked toward Asa, his head down, fumbling with the zip-tie cuffs on his belt. He would not meet Asa's eyes. Asa did not resist. He did not move. He simply stood, his hands raised, and let the final humiliation happen. He, Asa, the last guardian, was being arrested by a boy who knew. He was wrong. All while the man who had set the trap, the man of malice, was sleeping warm in his bed. His work done. Ben's hands were shaking as he cinched the plastic tie around Asa's wrists, binding the bloody, torn palms together. The plastic cuffs were tight. They bit into the torn skin of Asa's palms, the sharp-edged plastic grinding against the raw, bloody flesh. The pain was a small, sharp thing, a tiny island in the vast, cold ocean of his failure. He stood, bound like a common criminal, and watched two men in uniforms desecrate a sacred moment. Right, Miller said, all business, his attention now fully on the wolf. He had his suspect secured. Now for the evidence. Ben, get the cutters from my sled. The leg's awash. We're not splinting this thing out here. We tag, bag, and transport. Ben, his face a mask of misery, went to Miller's machine. He returned with a pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters, their red handles stark against the snow. "Sir, are you sure?" Ben asked, his voice low, almost pleading. "We could, maybe, we could freeze to death out here while you play veterinarian," Miller snapped. "This is not a pet, Ranger. It's a specimen. Now stand back. I'll admin the tranq." Miller raised the tranquilizer pistol he'd been holding. The yearling was still unconscious from the pain and shock, a limp, cream-colored bundle in the snow. Miller didn't care. He aimed for the flank and fired. The pop hiss of the dart was a small, obscene sound in the profound quiet. The pup's flank jumped, a reflexive spasm, and then was still. "Give it a minute," Miller said, checking his watch. "Let the cocktail work." Asa watched. This was the procedure. This was the law of man. It was cold, and it was loud, and it smelled of oil and chemicals. It was a violation. His own attempt, with his hands and his voice, had been a prayer. This was an autopsy. From the trees, a sound began, a low, rising keen that started at the edge of hearing and built into a sound of unbearable grief. It was She Who Remembers, the alpha female. She had watched the whole thing. She had seen her yearling fall. She had seen her one human ally bound and helpless. And now she was watching two strange males, loud and violent, approach her child with strange, metal tools. Her howl was not the hunting call of the pack. It was not the song of the full moon. It was a sound Asa had never heard before. It was a keening, the sound of a mother at a grave. Miller ignored it. "Ben, now. Cut the chain, then cut the trap. I don't want to move it with that thing attached." "Sir, the pack." Ben looked nervously at the trees. The other wolves, emboldened by their mother's grief, were moving, their shadows restless and visible. "The pack will stay back. Do your job." Ben knelt. He put the jaws of the bolt cutters on the trap's anchor chain. He squeezed. The crunch of the metal shearing was a sound that made Asa flinch. The chain snapped. "Now the trap itself," Miller ordered. Ben repositioned. This was harder. He had to get the cutters under the yearling's mangled leg to cut the spring mechanism. He was clumsy, his hands thick with gloves, his mind clearly not on the work. He lifted the leg. It moved with a wet, broken looseness. Asa had to look away, just for a second, his stomach turning. Crunch. The steel spring snapped. Crunch. The other side. The trap, now just a collection of dead metal parts, fell open. "Good," Miller said, satisfied. "Bag the leg. That's evidence. Bag the trap. That's evidence, too." He gestured to the yearling. "Now, let's get the specimen on the sled. We're burning daylight." They grabbed the pup. Ben took the front, Miller the back. They lifted it. There was no care, no respect for the spirit that lingered there. They lifted it like a sack of feed, a bundle of fur and broken bone. They swung it up and dumped it onto the cargo rack of Miller's snowmobile, the body landing with a soft, heavy thump. The alpha female's howl cut off, as if strangled. That thump, that was the unforgettable thing. That was the sound that broke Asa's heart. The sound of a life, a spirit, a sacred being, reduced to cargo, reduced to a specimen. Miller was already strapping it down with bungee cords, pulling them tight over the limp body. Ben just stood there, his hands, covered in wolf blood and grease, hanging uselessly at his sides. He looked at Asa, his eyes hollow. "I'm sorry," Ben whispered. Asa could not answer. He just watched as Miller, his procedure complete, walked back toward him, his face a mask of cold, bureaucratic satisfaction. The ride back was a different kind of violation. Asa was ordered onto the back of Ben's snowmobile, his bound hands resting in his lap, the plastic biting into his wrists with every jolt. He was a prisoner on his own land, being transported by a machine that screamed its dominance over the quiet. Miller led the way, his machine fast and aggressive, the cargo rack on the back, with its tragic, sacred burden, bouncing over the drifts. Asa did not look at the yearling. He kept his eyes on the trees, on the land that was his witness. He could feel Ben's misery radiating off him in waves. The young ranger drove with a jerky, uncertain hand, his body language a study in conflict. He wanted to speak, Asa knew. He wanted to apologize, to explain. But Miller's law was absolute, and Ben was trapped in it, just as the yearling had been trapped in the steel. They rode for 10 minutes, the whine of the engines echoing off the ridges, a sound that would send every living creature for miles into hiding. They were a parade of official mechanical noise. They came around a sharp bend in the old logging spur, and Miller suddenly slammed on his brakes. His sled skidded, slewing sideways, kicking up a high plume of snow. Ben reacted a second later, stopping just short of a collision. Blocking the trail, angled as if to turn around, was a familiar, rusting blue Ford. The engine was idling, a plume of dirty smoke chuffing from the tailpipe. Silas, he was leaning against the driver's door, smoking a cigarette, as if he had been waiting for them. He wore no hat, his thinning hair greasy and flat. He looked, for all the world, like a man who had just happened to stop to enjoy the view. A view of what? There was nothing here but trees and snow. Miller pushed his visor up, his face a knot of pure annoyance. Damn it, Silas. What in the hell are you doing blocking the trail? Get this junk heap moved. Silas took a long, slow drag from his cigarette. He didn't seem surprised or intimidated. He just looked at them, his eyes, small and cold, taking in the scene. He looked at Miller. He looked at Ben. And then his gaze found Asa, sitting on the back of the sled, his hands bound. A slow, reptilian smile spread across Silas's face. It was not a smile of humor. It was a smile of victory. He'd won. He saw the old Indian, bound. He saw the grim faces of the rangers. His eyes flicked, just for a second, to the cargo rack on Miller's sled. He saw the bagged, broken pieces of his trap. He saw the limp, fur-covered shape strapped beside it. He knew. And he knew they couldn't touch him. Ben saw it too. He saw the smirk. He saw Silas look at the evidence. The young ranger's hand, resting on the handlebar, clenched into a white-knuckled fist. The pieces, which had been floating in his head, Asa's claims, the illegal trap, the S-mark, Silas's presence, slammed together into a single, ugly picture. Silas. Ben's voice was low, shaking with a suppressed rage that surprised Asa. This ain't your permitted line. What are you doing up here? Silas shrugged, the picture of lazy innocence. Just checking the snowpack, Ranger. Seeing if the elk are moving. It's public land, ain't it? I'm a public citizen, same as him. He jerked his chin at Asa. Seems you got your hands full today. Catch a poacher? The word hung in the air, a deliberate, poisoned dart aimed directly at Asa. Move your truck, Silas, Miller commanded, his voice tired. He didn't care about the details. He had a suspect in custody and a specimen to log. This was a messy complication, and he just wanted it gone. Sure thing, Chief. Silas flicked his cigarette into the pristine snow, a small, sizzling act of disrespect. Whatever you say. He ambled over to the driver's side, opened the creaking door, and put the truck in gear, backing it up just enough to let them pass. as they idled by, Miller first, then Ben. Silas looked directly at Asa. The smirk was gone, replaced by a look of cold, triumphant hate. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. Miller, oblivious, or more likely, indifferent, was already on his radio, reporting to the station. "Have a 1021 for me at the station," he barked. "One mail, federal charges pending." As the logging spur opened up, Miller turned his sled and gunned the engine. Ben had to follow. Asa looked back, one last time. Silas was already lighting another cigarette, a small, dark figure against the white. The man who had set the trap, the man who had committed the crime, left alone and free, whistling a tuneless, jaunty song as the Guardian was carried away. The ranger station was too hot. It smelled of stale coffee, wet wool, and the metallic tang of cheap disinfectant. It was the smell of bureaucracy, a world of paperwork and insulated walls that held the real world at bay. Asa sat on a hard plastic chair, his hands free but aching, the ghost of the plastic cuffs still on his skin. Miller had finished with him. The man had processed the suspect with the same cold efficiency he had processed the specimen. Asa had been given a citation, a pink sheet of paper that accused him, in its blocky official type, of interference with federal wildlife management and tampering with a crime scene. He was given a court date in a town 2 hours away, a place he hadn't seen in a decade. Miller had left, his work done, his book satisfied. It was Ben who was left to finalize the release. The young ranger couldn't look at him. He shuffled the papers on his desk, his face pale and tight, with a guilt that was a poor, thin substitute for justice. "Here," Ben said, pushing the pink copy toward Asa. That's yours." Asa said nothing. He didn't reach for the paper. Ben finally looked up, his eyes miserable. "Asa, listen. About the pup, the yearling." He swallowed, the words heavy in his throat. "It's policy. It's being flown to the State Conservation Center. The leg's too bad, He didn't need to finish the sentence. Asa knew. "It will not be coming back," Asa stated, his voice flat. It was not a question. Ben shook his head, looking back down at his desk. "No, never. They'll put it in a preserve, or worse. It won't ever come back to the pack. I'm sorry." Asa finally picked up the pink paper. He folded it once and tucked it into his pocket. He stood up. The chair squeaked in the quiet room. "What about Silas?" Asa asked, his voice soft. Ben's face tightened. There's no proof. Miller says it's circumstantial. Your word against his. The trap is not enough." Of course, it was not enough. Asa turned and walked to the door. "Asa," Ben called out, his voice desperate. I know what I saw. I'm sorry." Asa paused at the door, his back to the young man. "The law of man is very loud," Asa said, his voice just a whisper. "But it does not hear very well." He opened the door and stepped back out into the cold, clean air, leaving the world of paper and apologies behind. The walk back was long. The sun was gone and the world was painted in 1,000 shades of blue and gray. The cold was a comfort, a truth. It numbed his hands and his face, but it could not touch the cold, hard stone in his chest. When he reached the clearing, hours later, the ice moon was high. The scene of the violation was empty. The snowmobile tracks were already softening, being erased by the wind. The blood was gone, covered. The mountain was already healing its scar, as it always did. But the silence was wrong. It was not the breathing, living silence he had known his whole life. It was an empty silence, a hollowed-out, grieving silence. He stood in the clearing and listened. No call, no faint rustle. The white pack was gone. He knew, with a certainty that went deeper than thought, that they would not return. Not here. The trust, that ancient, fragile bond between his world and theirs, had been broken. Not by him, but because of him. His presence, his attempt, had brought the noisy, violent world of men crashing into theirs, and they had fled. He was, at last, truly alone. Unforgettable. The word echoed in his mind. This was the unforgettable thing. This silence. He knelt, his bad knee cracking, at the spot where the yearling had fallen. He ran his hand over the new snow, a benediction, and his fingers, still raw, brushed something hard and cold just beneath the surface. He scraped the snow away. It was not a rock. It was a dark metal ring. Miller's procedure, in its haste, had been sloppy. Ben, in his shame, had been blind. Asa pulled it from the snow. A second trap, a number 4 coil spring. Silas's trap, it was still set, armed, oiled, and hungry, waiting in the dark, not 10 feet from the first. The Rangers, with their laws and their equipment, had missed it. They had secured their suspect and their specimen, and they had left the real crime, the real threat, buried in the snow. Asa stood up, the trap heavy in his hand. He looked at it, the moon glinting off the oiled steel. This was the truth. This was the reality of the law of man. It was loud, and it was blind, and it was incomplete. He looked up, his face to the cold, unforgiving moonlight. His gaze found the trees, the darkness, the place where the camera would have been. There was no sadness in his eyes, no anger, only the cold, patient, and terrible resolve of the mountain itself. The unforgettable truth was that the system had failed. The pack was gone, and he, the guardian, was the only one left to hunt the hunters. We're left with a question that I can't answer alone, and I want to hear from you in the comments. Who truly failed their duty in this story? Was it Silas, the man who set the illegal trap? Or was it Miller, the man who blindly followed the law? This story is one of many. There are countless others, hidden in the quiet corners of this land, that go unheard. If you believe these stories of truth, of real life, need to be told, subscribe to this channel, because we have many more to tell.